This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, I start again. Today we're going to have the presentation prospect for Venezuelan debt restructuring and economic reconstruction. And it's going to be presented by Mr. Stephen Carman, which he is the founder and president of Carman Associates, a New York City-based strategic advisory firm specializing in providing strategic advice to clients involved in complex and challenging international restructuring situations, with a special focus on emerging markets around the globe. Mr. Carman is a leading expert on international debt restructuring and cross-border insolvency, and he served formerly as the General Counsel of the New York State Financial Control Board, the Chief Financial Oversight Agency for New York City, and as the lead attorney with the Export-Import Bank of the United States, the official export credit agency of the U.S. government. He has worked on numerous high-profile and complex restructuring and infrastructure project transactions in emerging markets. He has also advised multilateral institutions and national governments in developing countries and emerging markets on a wide range of financial and commercial matters. He has published numerous articles in the leading professional journals, held leader positions in major professional organizations, and taught at law school in the U.S. and China, including Peking University School of International Law in Sichuan and University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. He is frequently invited to lecture on prestigious forums around the world, including programs in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and North America. He is a fellow of the American College of Bankruptcy and founding member and former two board member of International Insolvency Institute, and a member of the International Exchange of Experience on Insolvency Law. He served as a co-chair of the American Bar Association Subcommittee on International Bankruptcy of the Business Bankruptcy Committee, and currently serves as the vice chair of its coordinating committee for the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, and as the American Bar Association delegate to United National Commission on International Trade Law Working Group 5. He's a former Henry Luce Scholar in Singapore. He received his juris doctor from Yale School and his bachelor from Swarthmore College. Well, Mr. Farman, you can put the presentation in full page, and you can start now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carlos, for that very kind introduction. And of course, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be speaking to all of you this morning. And I'm very happy to do this. My plan is to set forth some thoughts on debt restructuring and economic reconstruction issues, hopefully to stimulate some ideas in the group and for further discussion. And to the extent I discuss any legal issues, it won't be any legal advice for you. You should consult with your lawyers. So without further ado, the title of my presentation is Prospects for Venezuelan Debt Restructuring and Economic Reconstruction. And what I'd like to do is really tie the two themes together, debt restructuring and economic reconstruction, and show how the two ideas are, in effect, intimately intertwined. Venezuela, as you all know much better than I do, is facing a multi-dimensional crisis. It's a humanitarian and social crisis. It's an economic and financial crisis. And Venezuela is also facing a sovereign debt crisis. And the crisis calls for a multi-dimensional response. And that response we may have to wait for a new government to be able to put this response into effect. But in terms of the response Of course, the immediate priority needs to be a massive humanitarian relief effort, and that will call for a lot of international assistance. Second, there will need to be a huge economic reconstruction effort to rebuild the collapsed Venezuelan economy. And third, there will need to be a large-scale sovereign debt restructuring in view of the fact that Venezuela has outstanding an estimated $150 billion of debt and other liabilities. Just a quick point, in this presentation, we'll just focus on the economic reconstruction and the sovereign debt restructuring issues. We won't discuss the humanitarian relief issues, but as I say, for a new government, that will need to be an immediate priority. The Venezuelan situation poses unique challenges. It involves rebuilding an economy that has suffered the largest peacetime contraction in recent history. As many of you know, the contraction of the Venezuelan economy is even larger than the U.S. during the Great Depression, larger than Greece during its recent debt crisis, economic crisis. So it's really an unprecedented situation for a peacetime economy. The Venezuelan situation will also involve restructuring of the largest outstanding debt burden of any recent sovereign debt restructuring. As I said a moment ago, $150 billion or more of outstanding debt and other liabilities. As I was saying in my opening remarks, the efforts to rebuild the Venezuelan economy and restructure Venezuela's outstanding debt cannot be divorced from one another. They are very much intertwined. As part of any future debt restructuring, any potential external lenders, whether they are public or private, will not put any new money into Venezuela unless the new post-Maduro government has developed a solid economic plan. Usually, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, will look for a credible economic so-called reform plan based upon macroeconomic and so-called structural adjustments before providing financing to the sovereign debtor in question. But Venezuela's economic situation will require much more than a mere reform plan. Venezuela's current situation with a collapsed economy is not the typical backdrop for a sovereign debt restructuring. More than simply adjustment policies are required. Rather, one effectively needs to restructure and rebuild the entire Venezuelan economy. Potential lenders as well as creditors restructuring their debt will want to know that there is a cohesive and sensible plan for economic reconstruction, since future repayment of debt will depend on having a well-functioning economy in place that will generate the resources to help repay the debt over the long haul. Now, the elements of a debt restructuring deal could reinforce economic reconstruction efforts. As I will discuss later, any eventual debt restructuring plan may incorporate debt for equity swaps broadly conceived. And when I talk about broadly conceived, I'm thinking, for example, of what I discuss in the second bullet point, debt for equity swaps for oil and natural gas development rights or other mineral development rights. And to the extent such development rights are exchanged for debt that is to be forgiven, then such debt for equity swaps could be helpful to rebuilding oil and natural gas industry and the development of reserves of other minerals. Similarly, to the extent that such debt for equity swaps involve creditors swapping debt for shares or equity in privatized enterprises in select industries chosen by the government, then the government could effectively steer investment to certain industries that it would like to see rebuilt and redeveloped. Now I will discuss important priorities for economic reconstruction efforts. There should be several priorities. Rebuilding the oil industry. Of course, a new government will need to plan for the eventual phase out of fossil fuels as per net zero goals. A second priority will be diversification of Venezuela's economy. Venezuela can no longer remain so heavily reliant on one commodity, namely oil. It can no longer remain a one-trick pony, if you will. Venezuela and a new government will need to consider industries in which Venezuela can enjoy a comparative advantage going forward. A new government will need to plan for a transition to renewable energy and develop sectors of the economy that have been neglected but which have good economic potential. For example, tourism. And tourism could be a good potential source of foreign exchange, as many other countries around the world have discovered. A third priority would be privatization of uneconomic and unprofitable state-owned enterprises. And such uneconomic and unprofitable enterprises represent a drain on the national treasury. A fourth priority would be rebuilding Venezuela's infrastructure that is necessary to support economic activity. Most prominently would be the electricity grid, but other infrastructure development would also be necessary. And for this, the new government might consider the use of PPPs, private-public partnerships, and project finance techniques. In order to rebuild the Venezuelan economy, a new government will need to attract foreign investment. Capital from official sources for rebuilding Venezuela is likely to come from many sources, including the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, regional development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank, or CAF, and countries around the world that are willing to provide financial support for Venezuela's recovery. Of course, if there is a new government, and especially a new government that is democratically oriented, there should be much financial support along these lines that would be available. But public capital alone is likely to be insufficient given the enormity of the task of rebuilding the economy, and therefore Venezuela will also need to attract private capital. A significant part of this capital will likely need to come from foreign investors. To attract foreign investment, a new government might consider steps such as the following. Rejoining ICSID, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. That's the World Bank affiliate that handles investor-state disputes. Foreign investors will obviously want comfort that investment disputes will be handled fairly in a neutral and independent forum, especially in view of the spate of nationalization and expropriations that took place under Chavez. Another step to attract foreign investment, review oil joint venture ownership rules. As a general matter, A new government should review the laws and regulations related to foreign investment and review the hydrocarbon law. And with respect to all of these laws and regulations, a new government would want to think about how these laws and regulations are actually implemented. And the idea would be to ensure that all of these laws and regulations and their implementation are conducive to foreign investment. A new government will probably want to review the royalty regime for oil production to assess whether the Venezuelan regime is competitive with other regimes in the region. And on a general point, a new government would want to review the permitting system and issuance of work visas to ensure that the investment process is attractive to foreign investors. Of course, a new government will need to ensure that the role of foreign investment in the Venezuelan economy is consistent with the desires of the populace. That's part and parcel of moving to a democratic form of government. For example, would the public be willing to support majority foreign ownership in oil joint ventures? Needless to say, investor confidence is key. Foreign investors will need to have confidence in the stability of the Venezuelan political situation under a new government in order to be comfortable in making foreign direct investments in Venezuela. But any eventual Venezuelan restructuring will be challenging for myriad reasons. For one thing, there's an incredibly diverse set of creditor constituencies, and that raises the possibility of intercreditor conflict, even intense intercreditor conflict. As you know, these creditor constituencies include bondholders, bilateral creditors, for example, China and Russia, suppliers and trade creditors, including oil field service providers, arbitration award holders. We rarely see this in a sovereign debt restructuring, or at least to the extent that it exists with respect to Venezuela. But there, as you know, there are arbitration awards outstanding running into the billions and billions of dollars. Another important creditor constituency are the development banks. Further, there are claimants to blocked payments, such as the foreign airlines that have not been able to get their hands on the foreign exchange that's being held in Venezuela. And then there are promissory note holders. Another reason any eventual restructuring will be so challenging and difficult is the sheer number of creditors. And that creates the potential for creditor coordination difficulties. As you know, in any sovereign debt restructuring, it's important to have smooth and effective creditor coordination. In connection with this, a new government will need to put in place a claims and verification and audit process to account for recognizing valid outstanding claims, but also to weed out any non-valid or corrupt debt claims. Another major challenge, and I don't know if this gets enough attention, is the challenge of making reliable multi-year economic projections as part of any restructuring exercise, particularly in light of the centrality of oil to Venezuela's economy. I call the following predictable uncertainties that are inherent in any projections for Venezuela. I call it predictable uncertainties in lieu of using Mr. Rumsfeld's term, known unknowns. There are uncertainties related to economic projections. What should be the baseline GDP growth in future years, given that the starting point is a collapsed economy. So necessarily all projections and predictions of economic growth are especially speculative under these circumstances. Uncertainties related to oil-related projections. Given the volatility of the price of oil, what would be a reasonable baseline figure for the price of oil per barrel for purposes of making oil revenue projections as part of an economic model for any debt restructuring? As you know, debt restructurings are predicated on developing a good economic model. So you need good inputs for that economic model. Another set of uncertainties related to oil-related projections concerns the degraded state of Venezuela's oil production capabilities. In light of that, how much oil can Venezuela reasonably be expected to produce going forward? To some extent, this may be mitigated by the use of oil warrants. For example, with oil warrants, if the price of oil exceeds a certain baseline price, then the restructuring debt holders would receive an additional payout. We'll return to this subject when we get into the features of a restructuring plan. A further reason that a Venezuelan debt restructuring will be so challenging is that the pool of resources available to support a restructuring may diminish the longer it takes to finally get to a debt restructuring, thereby making any eventual debt restructuring more difficult to achieve. Specifically, resources that might otherwise be used to support a restructuring risk being seized by creditors pre-restructuring. For example, see the ongoing situation with Citgo, which is, as you well know, widely referred to as the crown jewel of the PDVSA corporate group. This activity by creditors could result in what insolvency and restructuring professionals might call a, quote, premature dismemberment, unquote, of the insolvency estate, something that ordinarily a moratorium or stay under insolvency law helps prevent. This premature dismemberment is a product of a classic race to the courthouse by creditors. The bottom line is PDVSA and or the Republic of Venezuela will need breathing space during the restructuring so that assets will be protected from attachment. One wants to remove the incentive for creditors to become potential holdouts. In restructuring its debt, Venezuela will need to consider a range of standard restructuring techniques used in sovereign debt restructurings. That would include debt forgiveness, rescheduling or reprofiling of debt. And in connection with that, it may be very important for Venezuela to have the benefit of grace periods on debt service payments for the first few years of any restructuring plan so that Venezuela can start to get back on its feet economically during that period. Restructuring plan might also include adjustment of the interest rate or coupons on outstanding debt. And as a general proposition, it might also include what is referred to as a menu of options to be made available to restructuring creditors, as was provided for in the Brady bond exchanges and more recent sovereign debt restructures. And this would include, for instance, par, discount, and quasi-par bonds. Venezuela will also need to consider a range of less standard restructuring techniques, including debt for equity swaps. Now, standard debt for equity swaps in the sovereign context, those debt for equity swaps are a common feature in corporate debt restructurings, and they're seen as a pretty straightforward way to deleverage the balance sheet of a corporate borrower. But the sovereign context is obviously different because a sovereign by itself does not issue shares. Privatizations may be a necessary precursor to such swaps because with privatizations, there would be shares available to swap for debt. But unlike the debt for equity swaps that were used in Venezuela as part of the Brady bond exchanges in the late 80s and going into the 90s, the new government could not use the purchase of local currency as an intermediate step in the process, given that the bolivar is essentially worthless. So the new privatized enterprises wouldn't want to give away shares for essentially worthless currency. So that structure would need to be rethought from the Brady bond era. Another form of debt for equity swaps, broadly conceived, would involve oil and natural gas development rights. The government would, in this context, the government would need to carefully appraise the value of oil and natural gas development rights. The new government would not want to be criticized for giving away Venezuela's so-called national patrimony without receiving fair value in return. The debt holders as well, the creditors, would have to make an assessment of the value of such development rights and how long and expensive it would be to develop such rights, as well as make projections as to what price the output could be sold eventually. There could be debt for equity swaps involving other mineral development rights. As you all know, Venezuela is blessed with a broad array of minerals that exist in abundance in Venezuela. The issue is, would some of the restructuring creditors be interested in exchanging their debt for development rights in these minerals? And would a new government and the Venezuelan public be willing to support using mineral development rights for these purposes? A final form of debt for debt swaps would be debt for nature or climate swaps. Venezuela has important but potentially fragile ecosystems, such as rainforests, that may be suitable candidates for protection or conservation under such swaps. Now, these type of debt for nature and climate swaps have been used with some frequency in the last few years. Ecuador did this just this year in respect of the protection of the Galapagos Island ecosystem. Belize did this in 2021 with respect to the maritime conservation of its barrier reef. And Seychelles did this in 2017, again involving maritime conservation, and again involving so-called blue bonds for bonds relating to protection of maritime environments. Now, Venezuela may also wish to incorporate value recovery instruments, as they are called, as part of any debt restructuring plan in order to give creditors a possible upside in case of a better than expected performance. We touched on this first value recovery instrument briefly before, oil warrants. They were previously used by Venezuela and other oil-producing countries, such as Mexico and Nigeria, when restructuring debt as part of the Brady bond exchanges in the late 80s and 90s. Oil warrants could help mitigate the risk related to predictions of future price of oil. One other issue that oil warrants might deal with, they would need to be tinkered with the old form of oil warrants, but would be the oil production capabilities of a country. So if a country produced oil beyond a certain baseline, maybe that would trigger the oil warrants, or combining the two, the price and the oil production, one might think of a third trigger, which would be the total revenues received from oil production. Another type of value recovery instrument are the GDP-linked warrants. They have been an important feature in many recent sovereign debt restructurings, including Argentina and Greece, among others. And they may be of special significance in the Venezuelan restructuring context, especially in light of the uncertainty surrounding predictions regarding Venezuela's economic future, given the current collapsed state of the Venezuelan economy. Now I want to briefly discuss and conclude with a few long-shot options. In its debt restructuring and economic reconstruction efforts, Venezuela should consider certain strategies that may not yield immediate and/or guaranteed results, but if successful, could yield important benefits. First, repatriating as many Venezuelans in exile as possible. Second, recapturing wealth stolen from Venezuela. Third, considering the applicability of so-called odious debt arguments in connection with certain credit extended to the Venezuelan government if the loan proceeds were not used for legitimate purposes benefiting the Venezuelan people. First, we'll talk about repatriation of Venezuelans in exile. Venezuela has a hidden resource in its economic and societal reconstruction efforts. A potential massive infusion of human capital via the repatriation of Venezuelans in exile. Estimates are that 7 million or more Venezuelans have sought refuge in foreign countries since the onset of the crisis. This represents a loss of at least 20% of the pre-crisis Venezuelan population. Importantly, this represents a huge loss of talent and productivity for the Venezuelan economy. A new Venezuelan government will need to consider a broad array of measures that will make it attractive and relatively easy for Venezuelan exiles to return to Venezuela. Among other measures, the new government might consider offering training in new skills to returnees seeking employment in new industries or new areas of economic emphasis connected with the overall economic reconstruction effort. Now I'll talk about asset recovery, recapturing stolen wealth for the benefit of Venezuela. In light of the magnitude of wealth diverted from the Venezuelan coffers, a vigorous and wide-ranging asset recovery effort should be undertaken. As you all know, billions and billions of dollars, some estimates put it at hundreds of billions of dollars, have been diverted from the Republic of Venezuela and PDVSA's coffers. An asset recovery effort will not necessarily yield major results in a short period of time. It could easily take a number of years to bear significant fruit. A new government, therefore, should not count on any specific level of recoveries from this efforts within a prescribed period of time. Asset recovery can be very expensive when pursuing a complex, painstaking, geographically wide-ranging asset recovery effort. A new government might initiate asset recoveries on its own, using its own resources, while also drawing on the resources of international organizations to help guide its efforts. For example, there's a Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative known as STAR that's led by the World Bank and UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Yet a new government might also need the assistance, and probably will need the assistance, of outside third parties. For example, among other possible options, a new Venezuelan government might consider retaining professionals, lawyers, forensic accountants, and others to assist in the asset tracing and freezing process, which can be very complex and can involve many foreign jurisdictions. And a new Venezuelan government might explore whether it could retain such professionals on a contingency fee basis as opposed to an hourly fee basis. As you know, under a contingency fee basis, the professionals only get compensated if there is a recovery, and their compensation is based on the level of that recovery. The final long shot strategy would be come under the rubric of the odious debt doctrine. I refer to it more as a concept. When it reaches the state of a debt restructuring, will a new Venezuelan government want to consider trying to invalidate certain debts on the basis of the so-called odious debt doctrine? The odious debt doctrine gives a successor regime, such as a new Venezuelan government, a new Venezuelan government that's different than the prior regimes, a basis for challenging the enforceability of debt incurred by the predecessor regime. But it has not been officially recognized by courts or tribunals since the doctrine was first posited nearly a century ago. Again, that's why I refer to it more as a concept than a legally cognizable doctrine. There's a classic three-part test under the odious debt doctrine. It's whether A, the loan was not approved by the people, and B, the proceeds from the loan were not used for the benefit of the population, and C, the lender knew A and B when making the loan, i.e. it knew that the loan was not approved by the people and that the loan was not used for the benefit of the population. A new government in Venezuela might consider whether any of the loans that were extended to the prior Chavez-Maduro regimes were for purposes that did not benefit the Venezuelan people. Was it for the enrichment or self-aggrandizement of the rulers? Were the loan proceeds used for the repression of Venezuelan citizens? An odious debt doctrine case or concept would involve a fact-intensive inquiry and would raise issues of proof and evidence. For example, could one show that the proceeds from a specific loan made by a creditor were used for illegitimate purposes, and that the lender knew that the loan proceeds were to be so used when making the loan? If a new government were to intend to pursue an odious debt claim in court, it might consider whether the odious debt doctrine could be refashioned into, for instance, a more tried and true international law doctrine that has previously passed judicial muster, in contrast to the odious debt doctrine itself. Even if the odious debt doctrine, whether in its original form or refashioned form, is not used in court or does not gain any traction in court, The question is whether the mere invocation or mention of odious debt doctrine might give Venezuela some leverage, or at least the moral high ground in its negotiations with the creditor in question. Of course, when considering whether to invoke the odious debt doctrine, a new government would need to consider the benefits of doing so versus the effect that doing so would have on its reputation in the capital markets as a reliable borrower that is willing to honor its obligations. With that, I have concluded my presentation, and I know Carlos will open it up to Q&A. By the way, if we distribute the materials, I have a reading list that supplements what I've just been talking about. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for this very interesting presentation. I have some few questions in the chat. Let me address them to you. The first question is said, how many years would you recommend for investor recovering their investment? Do you have a feeling of what timing those investors will like to have?
Oh, for a debt restructuring?
No, for the people that what I understand from the question, from people that will invest in the Venezuelan recovery.
That's a good question. I would imagine they'd have to have a slightly longer time horizon than usual for various reasons. For one, the infrastructure in Venezuela is not what it should be at the current time. So infrastructure will have to be developed to support foreign investment. And so I would think investors will not be looking for an immediate return, but would need to be patient and willing to stay in the investment for a slightly longer period of time. The exact number of years, of course, would depend on the specific investment, but I don't think they should be looking for immediate returns.
Okay, thank you. I had another question. You can open the camera now, not the microphone, just the camera if you wish, the attendees. I had a second question. It says, can Venezuela apply to development banks credits based on the food production humanitarian crisis in order to establish its agricultural infrastructure such as public irrigation, reservoir, roads, and private creditors to tuna fisheries, ship owners currently operating in the Eastern Central Pacific Ocean? What credit preconditions could prevail? Do you follow me?
That's applying to the international institutions to support development of infrastructure generally or specific?
Mainly develop infrastructure in agriculture and fishing.
Oh, fisheries. Yeah, sure.
Actually, I think what he wants to know is that if this type of activity they can apply in these multilateral entities.
Well, to the extent that there's private sector involvement, in other words, to the extent that the fisheries are going to be a commercial enterprise, the IFC, for example, the International Finance Corporation, the private sector affiliate of the World Bank, might be a suitable potential source of financing. And then, of course, anytime one's thinking about that type of investment, the national export credit agencies that all of the major industrialized countries have and a lot of developing countries have might also be a source of financing. In that case, the financing would have to be tied to exports from the country of the export credit agency. So I think there would be different sources of potential financing for something like fisheries, whether it's IFC or a private sector part of the Inter-American Development Bank, or, as I say, the national export credit agencies.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is, assuming a government change in Venezuela, new government, what this new government should do, this is an interesting question, should do in the first 90 days to attack hyperinflation, dollar economy, and salary situation? That's a good advice question.
I think that's the $64,000 question, if you will, and especially in a short time frame like 90 days. Actually, on this, I haven't focused on this in my presentation, and I know the macroeconomists would have much more valuable thoughts and opinions on this issue, but of course, the inflation has to be brought under control. The currency, something has to be done about that, so you have a currency that has real value, whether it's tied to the dollar or not. Whether all that could be done in such a short period as 90 days is an open question. And as I say, this would be more a question for the macroeconomists.
Just a second, I gotta. Just a second, Steve.
Ese es Jorge.
It's Jorge. Give me a second, Steve. I got to get somebody else. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry for interruption.
Well, no, that was my answer, that obviously all of those issues that were mentioned in the question have to be addressed, and real economic activity can't take place unless they're addressed in a meaningful way. The time frame for addressing them and the specific steps, those need to be considered carefully and debated. But again, I would defer to the macroeconomists who have much more expertise in this area than I do.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is the attendee say, we fully agree with you that Venezuela, our national oil and gas industry, will need to private investment to handle our economy. As you know, the level of debt will impact any plan we may develop. Do you have any hard information about how much is external legal debt we have in Venezuela? Who may be the potential investor and lender, as far as you know, how long such debt will be paid off?
I think if I heard correctly, the first part is how much debt there is. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. If you have any hard data about the amount of the debt.
Well, yeah, I've seen various estimates, and I think, in all fairness, they're just estimates. I think that when a new government comes into office, the type of government that we hope will come into office, it will need to basically do an audit of outstanding debt obligations, and it will have to see, certain parties will present debt claims, and some of those debt claims may not be properly documented, and so may not be worthy of recognition as a valid debt claim, or they may be the result of corruption or other improper dealings, so again, not worthy of recognition. But the figure that is often thrown around is 150 billion or more of outstanding debt and liabilities. But I think really at the end of the day, these are all just guesses, estimates. One might not know until this debt reconciliation process gets underway. And actually, in the example of Iraq, when it was doing its sovereign debt restructuring in the mid 2000s, they set up a special debt reconciliation office to handle this whole process. And they brought in one of the big accounting firms to oversee that. They set the office up in Amman, Jordan. So I've tried to answer the first part of the question. I didn't hear so well the other parts of the question.
Oh, yes. If you are familiar with who are the potential investor and lenders, and an estimate of time for this type of debts to be paid off.
Well, at this point, so much of the debt has changed hands over the years. So those who were originally holding the debt are no longer holding debt in most likelihood. And but potential investors, these would be investors who are willing to take more risk because, and we're talking about the debt here. Is that right, Carlos? We're not talking about foreign investment in general, but
No,
about
the debt.
Yeah, the debt. Because it's open to some speculation as to how debt will perform. And one can see, for example, in Argentina, the debt in the last few days since the initial round of the presidential election down there, the debt has dropped in value, so debt can be highly volatile. But the debt, as I said in my presentation, I think assuming a debt restructuring is reached at some point in the not too distant future, but of course we have to wait for a new government probably. The first few years of the restructuring plan may involve a grace period of a few years. So I don't think this debt will pay off in a very short period of time, but the new debt holders would be looking for some type of return that compensates them for the risk of holding it for a longer period of time. And given the uncertainty surrounding Venezuela's future economic performance. So that's all I can say at a general level. Of course, a lot of this will be market driven. What the investors are looking for and demanding, and that will come out in restructuring negotiations. And when a restructuring plan is developed and the government undertakes some type of roadshow, these issues will be given greater definition.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is about referee. A critical aspect is that both parties, the Venezuelan state and the debt holders, will need some type of creditor arbitrator. Who could play that role, the referee or arbitrator role? The IMF, World Bank, or some special representative of the State Department?
This is as to any of the debt claims or to specific debt? Any debt claims?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as I was just mentioning, one way to handle this, if there are disputes as to the debt claims that are presented by putative creditors, one precedent for this, as I mentioned, was in the Iraq restructuring when the Iraqi government set up this debt reconciliation office, and it was presided over by one of the big accounting firms. And they had to, in that case, one of the particularities of that situation was that there were a lot of commercial contracts between parties and the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And so the paperwork on some of those contracts was very spotty. And so the Debt Reconciliation Office had to determine whether there really were any valid contracts between the government and the commercial party, and if so, what were the terms? And so I'm not sure the IMF would be, IMF or some similar party would be the best party for that, but it would have to be something that the creditors and the government could agree upon, and maybe some other third party along the lines of a accounting firm might be one possibility. The IMF, the reason I express some hesitancy on the IMF is that the IMF will have other roles, will be wearing other hats in this situation. So one wouldn't want to create a situation where there's the potential for any conflict of interest.
Thank you, Steve. I had two questions. I'll read in the next. I'll read you the first one. Can you elaborate on the National Assembly resolution regarding the statute of limitation? I don't know if you're familiar with that statute of limitation. Yeah, okay. I'm interested in understanding how markets are interpreting this decision. How markets are interpreting this statute of limitation.
How much? I didn't hear the question.
How the market are reacting to this new law that the regime, the National Assembly established.
I can't tell you exactly how the market's reacting, but I know there have been some questions raised as to, this is really a question for the Venezuelan lawyers, for them to offer their opinions, but as to whether the National Assembly, in this case, had the authority to enter into that type of tolling agreement, is it really something that should be undertaken by the executive branch? And I know that there's no longer in place an interim government operating under the umbrella of the National Assembly. So it's a complicated question. I can't tell you how the market's reacting per se, but I know there have been some questions raised, and really the Venezuelan lawyers could offer a more fine-tuned response on that type of issue as to whether it was a validly adopted resolution with respect to tolling issues.
Okay, the second question from this person, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, say, your proposals are based on a basic premise, the new government with the legitimacy necessary to restructure the debt. But what would happen if the government does not arrive in the short term? For how long will creditors wait for the debt restructuring? In case we don't have a new government, the regime.
Well, if there's no new government, and if the Maduro government continues on the path that it's on in recent months, in other words, taking steps that might prevent a fair and open election, and by barring certain candidates for running for office, or trying to undermine the electoral council. I believe that many Western creditors would be reluctant to enter into a debt restructuring deal if the government continues to move in that direction. So I think it's difficult under the current circumstances. Now, if there were a transition government, or if there were a full-blown move to a democratic government, that would be a different story. But it's not just the Western creditors and the Western governments, but the international institutions that will be so important in any overall restructuring, reconstruction effort. For example, the IMF. I don't think they're going to want to do business with the Maduro regime in its current state.
Okay, thank you, Tim. The next question is, when the IMF needs a credible plan, you taught that in your presentation, which part will have the final decision of it? Be a consensual agreement for both parties, or is it a decision of the IMF, for example?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, it's going to differ in the Venezuelan context than the usual context, because as I was mentioning, this situation calls for more than just mere adjustment policies. Adjustment policies can have a very major effect, but when I say mere, it's not just making changes in macroeconomic policy or structural changes to an economy. This is really rebuilding the economy from the bottom up. So when the IMF and other creditors get involved, credibility as to an economic plan is really in the eye of the beholder. And so at the end of the day, if there's going to be an IMF package for a country, whether it's Venezuela or whether it's Sri Lanka or Pakistan or Egypt, the IMF executive board would have to be satisfied that the plan makes sense. Now, there's an intermediate step in that process when the IMF is involved. The IMF staff works with the sovereign debtor, with the government of the sovereign debtor, to develop a plan that might be acceptable back in Washington to the executive board of the IMF. So the development of a plan is not done in a vacuum. And the plan that's developed is the product of discussions and negotiations between the government and the IMF. And then once that's agreed upon, and there's a so-called staff-level agreement by the IMF, then it goes back up to the executive board of the IMF. So at the end of the day, the final determination as to the acceptability of a plan and whether that plan is credible, if you will, is up to the executive board of the IMF. But it's the result of a months-long process of discussion and negotiations, in effect, between the IMF and the host government.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is related to the expropriated assets. And they're asking, will these assets be returned to will these assets should be returned to their former owners? Should they be included in the private privatization? Should they be compensated and provide damage to the original owners?
Well, as you know, many of these claims related to expropriation have gone to arbitration, and ICSID arbitrations, even though Venezuela withdrew from ICSID several years ago, those cases that were underway in ICSID prior to Venezuela withdrawing from ICSID, those cases continued. And so, as many of you know, there have been major multi-billion-dollar judgments in several of these cases, and I believe some might still be pending. So, for example, Crystalex and ConocoPhillips, among others, have received major arbitration judgments in their favor. Now, the question is, in all of these cases, as with any judgment from a court, one gets a judgment, and then how does one enforce the judgment? And can one attach assets? And that's why the Citgo-related assets in the U.S. have become such a tempting target for those who hold judgments against, in several of those cases, against the Republic. But I won't get into all the details, but there's this notion that of the alter ego. So those, this comes from the District Court of Delaware and upheld by the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, that the judgment against the Republic of Venezuela could be enforced against PDVSA and the assets of PDVSA, because PDVSA was in effect acting as the alter ego of the Republic. And so that's a major game changer in this sovereign debt restructuring, because usually the sovereigns have very few assets overseas that are susceptible to attachment by creditors holding a judgment. But this Citgo situation changes that whole equation, and that's made possible in several of these cases by that alter ego ruling.
Thank you, Steve. There is a question here about the Bolivar. Should Venezuela stay on the Bolivar base, or should we change to dollars base?
Again, that's a $64,000 question, if you will. I wouldn't say bolivars, because 64,000 bolivars I don't think could get you very much. But again, that's a question for the macroeconomists more than for me. But regardless, Venezuela will have to do something to reestablish the credibility of its currency, and that will be important for rebuilding the economy and giving confidence to investors. Not to mention making sure the compensation for your average Venezuelan worker is worth something. When they go home with payments in bolivars, that doesn't get them very far. So, but as I've said, that type of issue is more a question for some of the top-level macroeconomists that are thinking about these issues with respect to Venezuela.
Okay. Considering the energy transition and other opportunities in the investment world, do you think Venezuela will have a lot of companies interested in investing in the country? And the second question is, there should be an internal. Okay, let's ask the first one. Do you think Venezuela there will be a foreign company interested in investing in Venezuela?
That's a great question, and as I say, there are a lot of prerequisites that need to take place before the foreign investors will come back in. And I mentioned one, and I just talked about it a few minutes ago, ICSID. Foreign investors aren't going to come back in any major way, may not come back in any major way until Venezuela rejoins ICSID. And because, as I said in my presentation, they'll want comfort that a dispute between the investor and the state, i.e. the government of Venezuela, will be handled fairly and properly and in an impartial forum. So there are a lot of steps that will need to be taken before the foreign investors may feel comfortable about coming back into Venezuela. In other words, the foreign investors aren't going to want to go through the experience that they had with the Chavez and Maduro regimes. And so they'll want to see a completely different environment that's more conducive to foreign investment. I mentioned also that political stability is part of that equation as well.
There is a question here asking you if you have worked with some Venezuelan economies or in assembling a plan to restructure the legal debt of Venezuela. Have you done that type of work? Can you answer that question?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
The question is that if you had previously have worked with any Venezuelan economies in assembling a plan to restructure Venezuelan legal debt.
Worked with the Venezuelan economists.
Work with.
Yeah, worked with. I haven't worked with any of the Venezuelan economists, no, but, I've thought about the issues and I've written a number of articles about these issues. And, I think the economists are critical to the debt restructuring issues and the economic reconstruction issues. And I should say it's really going to require an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary effort. The lawyers, the economists, people in finance, and then your technical experts, many of whom are on this call right now who have experience in the different industries so important to Venezuela, such as oil and gas. So that's how I would respond to that.
Okay. There is another question here. Could the Development Finance Corporation, I understand multilateral organization, will help in solving the agricultural infrastructure of Venezuela? Will they be willing to, this international, the multilateral organization will willing to invest on the agricultural sector?
Oh, agriculture.
Yes.
Well, one avenue for that, I'm not an expert on the Venezuelan agriculture situation, but for example, if there were a need for irrigation systems, if that was something that was important for the agricultural sector in Venezuela, that's something the development banks could assist with. That would just be one example that comes immediately to mind. But also, once the agricultural products are produced and maybe they'll be exported to North America, for that one needs good ports and railways to get the goods from the where they're produced to a place where they can be shipped out of the country. So ports is another area that the multilaterals and export credit agencies and others might be interested in financing. I don't know if there was a specific area within agriculture, but that would be my general thought, in particular as it relates to irrigation systems. if
Okay.
that's relevant in the Venezuelan context.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Steve. Now, I finished with the chat question. Now we're going to give the right to ask the question live. I got 5 people. I remember it's only 3 minutes, 3 minutes maximum. So we start with Gilberto Morillo.
Hello. Thank you
Hello,
for
Gilberto.
your presentation, Mr. Carmen. Um, these are my questions. The first question is, I worked in the 1990 debt restructuring for Venezuela, where the break-it bonds were created, and I also helped some investors in the Argentinian recent restructuring. In the Argentinian and Ecuadorian restructuring, the value, the market value of the debt after the restructuring was close to 50%. My question is if you think we can get a haircut of that size, if we can get 50% value of the new bonds that we will exchange for the debt restructuring. That's one question. The other question is the I have seen in the press that the United States have prosecuted several Venezuelans accused of corruption.
Yes.
But the corruption was not against the U.S., was against PDVSA, against the Republic, because of bribes and commissions, etc. But there is one guy that I read, a guy called Rincon, that I think he paid like $1 billion fine, and then he would get a short sentence. And there are other cases. Don't you think that those monies that the U.S. has taken should be returned to Venezuela? Maybe they can charge a fee or something for recovering, but not keep them for themselves, because that was not against the U.S. They said there were crimes committed with the U.S. accounts, but not against the U.S. So that's a thought that I think they should return part of that money to Venezuela. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the haircut, um, I think it's a little premature to be thinking about, or for me to give you an exact number as to what the haircut might be, because um, as I was mentioning in my presentation, one has to develop the economic models um, for what a restructuring would look like, and what the revenues coming into Venezuela, into the Venezuelan treasury would look like, and um, probably there will probably need to be a considerable haircut, but the exact magnitude I couldn't say at this point. I don't know if anybody has an exact estimate at this point. Probably need to be somewhat significant. But as I mentioned in my presentation, there may be other ways to give the creditors value, such as those debt for equity swaps that I mentioned, and then they might get value down the road with, say, GDP linked warrants. And it was interesting in the original Argentina restructuring back in the 2005 period, when that was done, a lot of the investors, that restructuring plan include GDP linked warrants, but a lot of the investors didn't put too much stock in those warrants. They thought, well, the Argentine economy is such a mess, it's likely to remain a mess. So how much value will these GDP linked warrants really have going forward? But as it turned out, the Argentine economy did perform better than expected, and grain and soybean prices rose significantly, and so that was a big benefit for the Argentine economy. And so the warrants, the GDP-linked warrants, had much more value than people originally thought. So there are different ways that the creditors might recapture some value, even if they do take a significant haircut. As I said, the exact magnitude of that haircut, I think it's hard to say at this point.
There was another question.
Oh, well, the second part of the question related to U.S. Prosecution of Venezuelan nationals and what happens with the assets that they froze and so on and so forth. Well, for one thing, and I haven't studied all of those situations, but I know some of the cases, for example, involved violations of our money laundering statutes. And I know a lot of the stolen or diverted wealth from Venezuela involves money laundering. And when you talk about money laundering, that's often going to go through the U.S. financial system. And so even though it doesn't involve harm against the U.S. in terms of stolen assets from the U.S., the U.S. is implicated because the U.S. financial system, the money laundering, is going through our system. So that's one part of my answer. Now, as to your the second part of your question, yes, the U.S. has frozen certain real estate, expensive mansions in Florida or wherever they may be. As to what happens with those assets, I'm not exactly sure. That's a good question. I think I would have to look into that to see what the ultimate disposition of those assets is. But certainly those Venezuelan nationals or ex-nationals who laundered that money or embezzled funds, whether through schemes related to PDVSA procurement or otherwise, they should not have the benefit of those assets. How the benefit goes back to the Venezuelan government in those particular cases, I can't give you an answer right now. I'd have to look into that and see what ultimately happened.
Thank you, Steve. Luis Velázquez, 3 minutos. Luis.
Okay, just a second. Thank you, Steve, for the presentation. Well, you may know that the Chinese company and Chevron are cashing in their debts with barrels they are producing themselves. Are you aware of that?
Well, I know, for example, China had the debt for oil or oil for debt deals. That I know about.
Okay, let me finish then. So that is a reality that is valid today. So I have 2 questions. In a debt for equity swap framework, what is your opinion if the government offer oil fields with production to Crystal X and other major creditors, individually or group, that can operate those contracts under a 10-15-year contract? That's one question. So in a complement of that is a comment, they can sell that contract to an operating company for the amount of the debt and settle then that account with the government. Or they themselves could operate the contract and collect the debt with barrels while paying reduced royalties and could continue to produce until the end of the contract and renew it with another royalty scheme a little bit more favorable to the government, which will make much more money than their financial debt, than their current debt. So that's one question. And the second is, How do you think this plan could be offered to these creditors? Thank you very much for your answer.
Well, um, that's an interesting concept that you have, and I think we'd all have to think through the implications of that a little more fully. But I think the general point I was making in my presentation may address some of the issues you've raised, which is some of the creditors may be willing to now. Crystal X doesn't have financial debt per se. It has a large arbitration judgment against Venezuela. But having said that, how is Venezuela going to satisfy that judgment? Well, Crystal X would have to, let's assume it doesn't get access to the Citgo assets in the U.S. Let's just assume that for the sake of argument. At least doesn't get access now. Citgo would have to, Crystal X would have to get in line with the other creditors, and because the way to do this sovereign debt restructuring is to do it as sort of a comprehensive process. In other words, not to do one-off deals before there's the whole package developed for all the creditors. And so in that context, if and when we got to a full-blown restructuring exercise, creditors like Crystal X might be interested in getting development rights to oil fields. Maybe they would, or maybe they wouldn't be, or maybe Crystal X, they had gold mines. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Maybe they would be interested in other mineral development rights as part of a debt for equity swap, as I discussed it in my presentation. But I think as a matter of good practice in terms of debt restructuring generally, sovereign debt restructuring in particular, a new government would have to deal with creditors like Crystal X, a creditor by virtue of its arbitration judgment, in the context of the overall restructuring of all of Venezuela's debt. It will be difficult to do a proper restructuring if the new Venezuelan government, or even the existing one, is making a lot of one-off deals with individual creditors.
Thank you, Steve. Evanan, 3 minutes, Evanan. Evanan. ¿Se me fue Evanan?
Ya, tengo el micrófono. ¿Me oyes, no?
Sí, ya te escuchamos.
All right. I certainly enjoyed Dr. Cartman's advice to what Venezuela need to undertake to get rid of the current deep crisis. It was definitely music to my ears. It was like listening to my leader in the opposition, exactly her economic financial platform. Anyway, however, you have to be aware, Dr. Carmen, that the Venezuelan crisis is a huge, like any other comparable crisis in the world so far. That's one element which I missed in your recitals of the challenges. And the other one is the long attachment to socialism. It began in the 1930s when Keynesian policies were applied in the U.S. for the huge financial crisis. And the leaders, so long as they live, stated a socialist state. In the last 25 years, that was deepened and became absolutely an absolute collapse. So my question is, how will you go about neutralizing the huge abhorrence or rejection of the Venezuelan leadership to free enterprise. That I think is the huge or the largest handicap and burden that Venezuelans have to get rid of socialism in all the state-controlled economic enterprises. So, any advice, any suggestion? Thank you.
That's another good, very broad issue that you've raised. And as to the first part of your comment, as to the magnitude of the crisis, I tried to allude to that in the first slide, at the bottom of that first slide, saying the Venezuelan situation is unique, given the huge contraction of the economy, as I said, and as many people have observed, largest contraction of a peacetime economy. So I think we all have to recognize that a lot of rebuilding and reconstruction of the economy needs to take place. Now, as to your second point about the socialist or non-free market tendencies, particularly in the last 20 plus years under Chavez and Maduro, however one characterizes their economic policies, I think it'll be important for the new government to explain to the Venezuelan people why the old approaches haven't worked, and how and why the alternative approaches that the new government intends to pursue might be much more effective in meeting the needs of the Venezuelan people. But I think individuals such as yourself and many others who are concerned about Venezuela could develop a very compelling case, economic case, as to why the policies under the current regime, and when I say current regime, including the Chavez regime, have been manifest failures and have harmed the people of Venezuela, and why new policies and a new program might be more successful, more effective, and deliver more material well-being to the people of Venezuela. So I think it'll be a process of education, process of give and take with the Venezuelan public, but really the losers in this whole scenario that Venezuela has been living through are the Venezuelan people. And I talked in my presentation about the social humanitarian crisis, the extraordinarily high rate of poverty, the breakdown in the healthcare system, the shortages of food and medicine, and the spread of disease. That doesn't sound like a very attractive system to me. And so I think the new government would need to come up with a program that addresses the real needs of the Venezuelan people and connect that to how their economic program and policies would deliver benefits, concrete, tangible benefits for the Venezuelan people. So that would be my general answer. I don't think there's any magic wand that people can wave to take the blinders off those who still believe in those Chavismo policies, except the hard realities that unfortunately the Venezuelan people have lived through for the past number of years.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, we have the last person to ask is Jorge Cancos, and with Jorge we close Eduardo and go to the over sobremesa. Jorge, adelante.
Mr. Carmen, excellent presentation. You covered all the economic aspects to recover the country in the medium and the long term. However, as you know, the whole country is in a total economic chaos. I understand the solution in the medium term is to recover the economy with long-term and medium-term loans and investments. However, in the short term, Venezuela will need humanitarian help, which cannot be repaid. And additionally, we have, as you also mentioned, and you know, 7 million Venezuelans out of the country, which a high percentage will return. Do you think that in the short term, there could be a special plan, not as a loan, but as humanitarian help, as we saw it in the past in other countries?
Great question again. And I said, although I didn't elaborate on it because I was focused on the debt restructuring and economic reconstruction, I said the first and immediate priority for any new government has to be the humanitarian relief effort. And as you're pointing out, the new Venezuelan government will have to approach the international community, whether the international institutions or international donor community, countries that want to see Venezuela turn around and help relieve the misery facing many Venezuelans. That will have to be not loans from those sources, but grants, if you will. There have to be a huge humanitarian relief package put together by the international institutions and by donor countries. And not to be repaid, but just to help relieve the suffering facing so many Venezuelans. Now, as to the those who have left Venezuela, as I was pointing out in my presentation, I think they could be an important asset to Venezuela as it tries to rebuild its economy. And so I think the new government will have to give careful thought as to what kinds of incentives, if necessary, it can provide to bring those people back, to help Venezuela get back on its feet. So that's what I would say. I hope that responds to your question.
Thank you,
Yes,
Stephen.
thank you.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We learned a lot, and I think that all we have a better vision about our possibilities and what to do in the future. And we'll keep in contact with you, of course. This is, we hope this is not the only the only conference that you give us. Thank you very much again. And now we'll pass to the after lunch meeting. Thank you for your time. I know that you gave us more than you promised to us.
Well, Eduardo and Carlos, thank you very much for organizing this. And as I said at the outset, it's been a great privilege to interact with you and all of your colleagues. And I think I was saying this before we went live, that one thing that gives me great hope and optimism about Venezuela's future is that there are so many people like yourselves who are committed to rebuilding Venezuela when a new government comes into power, and so many extremely talented and thoughtful people who are putting time and effort into this. But I'm happy to play my very, very small part. in sharing my thoughts with you, and it's been a real pleasure. And I thank everybody who participated in the webinar for their attention and for the excellent questions that they posed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Even
Goodbye.
we normally now we close the meeting and we go to what we're calling after meeting. If you want to stay, you're welcome.
Okay.
If you stay, we'll do it in English. And I don't know about your time. I know we are a little bit over your timing that you allow to us, but you can stay if you want. And normally in this after meeting, there are questions about the presentation or to any other matter. Okay?
Disfrutamos hoy de una excelente presentación. Yo por lo menos estoy muy satisfecho del enfoque que se dio y los esperamos entonces para la semana que viene y vamos a abrir entonces la sobremesa por un periodo de unos 20 minutos más. Los que quieran intervenir, por favor, anótense en el orden de palabras y por favor recuerden que son 3 minutos también. Adelante.
Eduardo, el señor Steven está, yo creo que debiéramos hablar en inglés si es posible.
Ok. Bueno, está en el orden de palabras Juan Santana.
Steve, thank you very much for your presentation. That was excellent. I learned a lot, and I ratify many of the concepts I already had. Gracias, Carlos y Eduardo, por traer to bring Steve to the table, to the presentation. I really enjoy it. We should have more of this kind of presentation in the future. I'm looking forward to a banana presentation next week because that looks also promising. So thank you very much. That was it.
My pleasure.
Evanan.
Okay. Well, let me say in English so Dr. Carmen can listen to it. Okay, I'll have the honor of being the speaker next to you, Dr. Carmen. So the challenge is quite important. Okay, so I think I will take use of some of your thoughts. I'm supposed to outline what are the main guidelines for the Venezuelan economic, political, social recovery in the next 5 years after dictatorship. Now you can determine the size of the challenge. I cannot speak on the formal leader of the opposition for which platform I'm devoting my time, because it hasn't yet been formally sanctioned. But I will give my own thoughts and ideas, which certainly are going to be part of that platform. So I wanted to make that remark, Eduardo. So it will be my own ideas. As you may know, I've been 6 years with the leader of the opposition, and most likely some of those things are going to be part of a fundamental part of the platform. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. ¿Alguien más quiere intervenir o...?
Yo creo que podemos... no, ahí está Milton.
No, ahí están Milton Chávez.
Okay, here I am. You listen to me?
Yes.
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 Okay. Well, first of all, Stephen, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. There are a lot of people here in this group that have a lot of knowledge, and if you count that, there are so many thousands of years there. But one of the things that I think we should probably think about is, there's going to be a lot of planning and work that remains to be done to put Venezuela in the right path to growth. And in my opinion, it is critical to determine what the sovereign Venezuelan government debts are legal. There may be many other debts that we have incurred that are illegal and therefore should not be honored. And I think, it was also talked about a major haircut of countries' legal debt will be required, just like what happened in other countries, as a precondition to tackle orderly and intelligently any debt restructuring. I don't know what your thoughts are, Mr. Carmen, but anyway. Also, and as I, I used to be an employee of the U.S. government, and in those days I dealt with many people that are here in this chat. One of them is Juan Sabo there when we were looking into export credit agencies, and I used to handle part of the Exim Bank portfolio. The other one that I think we should probably think about is in the old days we had the OPIC agreement, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation agreement with the U.S. And there may be a number of bilateral investment and tax treaties that need to be taking place with many countries in order to attract the investment that we need. So those are some of my thoughts, and I wonder if you have any comments.
Oh, sure. I don't know if you were aware, I was at Export-Import Bank a number of years ago, 99 through 2005. And so I know how important Exim can be in providing financing in countries like Venezuela. And to your first point, on some or many of the credits may not be legal. That's why I mentioned there's going to have to be an audit of the outstanding debts, and those debts that were improperly entered into, whether by virtue of corruption or some other reason, those will have to be disregarded, not included in the debt restructuring. And I understand there may be a fair amount of those types of debts. Now, you mentioned a major haircut. I think that won't come as a surprise to many of the creditors. Someone was mentioning a while ago, I think, the Argentina situation. May have been mentioning the haircut in the most recent bondholder restructuring. But whatever it was, Argentina, when it did its 2005 and 2010 restructurings, a huge haircut. Greece in 2012, a very large haircut. So, another oil-producing country, Iraq, a very huge haircut as part of that restructuring in 2005 or so. So a major haircut, no creditor welcomes that with any excitement or enthusiasm, but I think if creditors are being realistic and they look at the numbers that will be produced by the new Venezuelan government, I don't think they'll be totally in shock if a considerable haircut is called for. As I mentioned, though, there may be other ways to give consideration to the creditors, and there may be these debt for equity swaps, the various types I mentioned, or the oil warrants or the GDP linked warrants, so that the creditors can enjoy an upside if Venezuela does better than expected. And your final point, which brings us back to Exim Bank and OPIC and other bilateral export credit agencies and national development financial institutions. I think those will be a good source of financing if and when Venezuela makes the change to a new government, a new democratically oriented government. They will be eager to get in on that project of rebuilding the Venezuelan economy. And one thought I didn't really develop in any detail in the presentation was, I think one way that Venezuela can position itself to be attractive for foreign investment is if it becomes a role model, if you will, for other developing and emerging economies in terms of a green energy policy or a green economy. And if it becomes the showpiece, if you will, for international institutions and bilateral lenders, look at Venezuela and what they're doing. And if that became the case, I think Venezuela could tap into a lot of the sustainable financing that is now available. And I think that could be a promising avenue for Venezuela. It sounds ironic when we talk about an economy that's so heavily based on oil, but you do have a lot of resources, I know, that could be used towards that cleaner energy future. So that's just one thought that I didn't really have a chance to elaborate on during the presentation. But I think that also could unlock a lot of capital. As you know, that's all people talk about now is the transition to net zero and carbon-free future. And so I think to the extent Venezuela can plan for the transition, not only be a role model for just other developing countries, emerging markets in general, but also for the other oil-producing countries. And not just the major oil producers, but there are so many other oil-producing countries that will have to make that transition as well. So if Venezuela can make that transition successfully, I think it could be a showcase for international institutions and various countries around the world that provide finance for the developing and emerging economies. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. We didn't cross paths because I left the U.S. Embassy back in 1998. So anyway, I was always very close to Exim Bank, to OPIC, TDA, and other U.S. government agencies that helped Venezuela in those days.
Well, yeah, traditionally, Exim Bank and the other agencies had a great interest in Venezuela. Right. And because our companies were doing so much business there.
Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a darle Héctor Partidas.
Okay, gracias. Mr. Carmen.
Yes, I can hear you better now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, my question is, in view of the big problem that we have in our country on the social and very big problem that we are facing with our people, do you think that would it be possible to think on a new Marshall Plan?
A new Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan?
Yes. Well, I don't know what it will be called, but Venezuela will need a one-country Marshall Plan. It's going to need a huge infusion of capital, and first things first, it will be the humanitarian relief effort, I think. But after that, a lot of capital is going to need to flow into Venezuela from the international institutions, but also foreign governments. And those foreign governments that want to see a new democratic government in Venezuela succeed, they will have a vested interest in making capital available to Venezuela, whether through official public sources or private investors, encouraging the private investors. So whether you call it a Marshall Plan or something else, Venezuela will need a massive infusion of capital to rebuild the economy. You haven't had a war per se, but it's almost like you've been through a war. Your economy is in tatters. You know, your major industry has been run down. The people there have suffered, unfortunately, to a great extent in many ways. So it's almost like a post-conflict situation. But unfortunately, it happened in a peacetime environment.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Juan, ahora sí te toca a ti.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Carbon, for such an illustrating and instructive talk. My question is the following. Can you outline the basic premises for critical infrastructure development in Venezuela, which must be important multiplying factors of the economy, macroeconomy, and all that? I heard you talk about port infrastructure regarding to export to agricultural programs. But before you get to that, you still need a lot of infrastructure that has to be financed. So what are the basic premises that should be taken into account when we're dealing with, multilateral financing institutions?
Well, to the extent that you want to tap private capital and you think there's infrastructure that private investors would have an interest in, you have to come up with, in the project finance lingo, you have to come up with bankable projects. Projects where the lenders and investors could look to the specific project to generate the revenues to service the debt and provide returns to the investors. So, for example, I know you wanted to get away from the port example, but if you had a port or highways, toll roads, or power projects, those might be suitable candidates for project finance, PPP type arrangements. Now, other basic infrastructure that will not yield a commercial benefit in that way, basic infrastructure, maybe transmission lines would be an example. That may have to come from some of the multilaterals, like the World Bank, just to provide financing for that. But hopefully on favorable terms. But the other types of projects that could be run on a commercial basis, I think the project finance PPP type model could be useful. And for that, you have so many different sources of financing. You have the private sector affiliates of the World Bank, that would be International Finance Corporation, IFC. IDB has a private sector affiliate. Then you have, I don't know whether, I'm sure CAF, your Andean Development Bank, might have a private sector arm. And then you have what I was talking about a minute ago. You've got the national export credit agencies, the national finance institutions, development finance institutions. So there could be a lot of capital available, but that's premised on having projects that are, in the lingo, bankable. In other words, the projects will generate the revenues, the projects themselves, not dependent on other corporate entities, will develop generate the revenues themselves that can be used to repay debt and generate returns for the investors. I don't know if that answers your question, but those were my quick thoughts.
Thank you very
Eh,
much.
Víctor Vázquez.
Hi, Steve. Again, nice to see you, and thank you for your presentation. Most of the things that you have said, I don't know if there's a cause effect element here. There might be. Are concepts that were presented by Gabriela del Castillo from Columbia University, where she basically analyzed all the cases of debt restructuring in debt and in war turned apart countries, and she makes pretty the same points. And you mentioned that the fact that in Venezuela there's not a war going on makes a little difference. If we compare the results um, that we have. But one of the key issues that she points out, or that I took out of her work, was that first, yes, you need the support from the international monetary institutions and the World Bank, but almost as important as that is the fact that you need private capital as soon as possible, because that is what is going to be, um, moving the economy and employment once the third leg, which is the humanitarian support that you mentioned, is over. My question is, given that we talked about OPEC and so on in this conversation, OPEC was transformed into something which is the Development Finance Corporation. And that is a very interesting change, because now they seem to have realized that they need to compete with the Chinese. And, from what you can see from the outside, they have been doing a pretty good job. And if you ask me, I don't think that there would be any other institution or and place in the world uh, for the purposes of doing something that would be even as, or at least as critical as the provision of capital, and it's the coordination of work and the support that is going to be coming from different places, which is one of the things that Gabriela Castillo underlines. And I call that project management. So, what are your thoughts about the possibility of setting up some sort of super project management office for the purposes of managing something that is going to have never heard of complexity in the Americas?
Where would you want that office established? In Venezuela or?
Well, I think it should be in Venezuela, obviously.
Yep. You
But
mean what?
your thoughts? I ask you the question. Don't ask me.
I'm a lawyer. We like the Socratic method. Um, but Victor, thank you for your comments. Frankly, I am not familiar with Gabriela del Castillo and haven't read any of her work, so my thoughts are sort of independent of what she's come up with. And I'm just looking at it. I don't know what her specialty is, maybe economics, but I'm coming at sort of from the debt restructuring practitioner's point of view. And but you mentioned a few different things, and I don't disagree with you that some will, and as I said in the presentation, there have to be some public capital, whether it's IMF, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and don't forget, some of this can be combined, public and private. You've got IFC, the different tranches. You have the public tranche, and then you have the private lender tranche, and but all getting the benefit of that preferred creditor status. And So the public institutions, private capital, I mentioned how important that will be. DFC you singled out, and I've been following recently that I used to work a lot with OPIC when I was at Exim Bank. But I see OPIC is getting involved in some broader projects these days. For example, I see that they were involved in the Belize nature debt for nature swap, guaranteeing the bonds that were issued by the I think it was by the Nature Conservancy was issuing the bonds, but OPIC DFC providing the guarantee made the bonds credit worthy and or added to the credit worthiness of the bonds. So they are taking on a broader mandate apparently, and of course we've all been following what the Chinese have been doing throughout the developing world with the Belt and Road Initiative. I've just written some articles highlighting some of the debt problems that have emerged from that and how difficult that's making some of these sovereign debt restructurings, whether it's in Sri Lanka or in Zambia. The fact that there's such a large Chinese debt component, it's been hard to reconcile how the Chinese deal with sovereign debt restructuring versus how the Western creditors deal with it. So I don't know how much debt the Chinese still have outstanding to Venezuela. I know originally they had a large amount. I think it's down to a much, much smaller amount. But it may be interesting to see what their approach will be. And when you talk about China and Russia, of course, they may have, especially Russia, may have non-commercial considerations to the extent they have much debt left. I don't know what the exact number is. But, you know, Russia, for example, obviously would have probably have geopolitical interests that the average commercial creditor would not have. Now, you talk about a super project management office or something like that, and one of the keys when you're dealing with these projects is what the people in the field call project monitoring and evaluation. You know, it's nice to enter into all of these big projects and to enter into the memorandum of understanding and even some of the initial agreements, but someone's got to be monitoring that the projects are performing as per expectations and as per plan. And so a separate office for that might not be such a crazy idea. It depends, you know, how many projects and what the specific mandate is, but to keep the projects on track. Now, of course, you've had a situation in Venezuela where the previous governments, previous regime, as I'll put it, they announce a lot of big projects, but they become white elephants. I think that's hardly an experience you'd want to repeat in a new government. You'd want to make sure the projects are carried through to completion, but even beyond completion, that they continue to perform as they were supposed to perform. So I think that's an idea, definitely an idea worth considering.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question, Victor.
Well,
But as I say, I don't know anything about. Maybe I need to look her up, Gabriela del Castillo. But I'll look at her.
She unfortunately she passed away. She worked for a long time with multilaterals and from Columbia University. If I may say something short,
Yes,
may I?
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. What I was thinking about, Stephen, is that we have a systemic problem for the purposes of proceeding with investments. For instance, if I'm an investor who wants to do something in an industry, I'm going to need probably natural gas, and I'm going to need electricity, and I'm going to need the infrastructure in place. So there is an efficient way of doing things. I'm not going to invest the money up until the time I have contracts with counterparties that have the creditworthiness for doing things. So it's not as easy as I'm going to go there and invest the money. There is timing for things, and if there's nobody thinking about what's the smartest way of placing things, it's going to be very inefficient. So, uh,
Yes.
you know,
I,
that
I
thinking, someone has to organize that. On
yeah.
the one hand, on the other hand, the other issue is that whenever countries are providing humanitarian support, unfortunately, politicians want to take pictures of themselves providing things. And at the end of the day, what happens is that they fight, and in many cases, Gabriela del Castillo describes that what happens is that it ends up being extremely inefficient, but because you end up getting the a lot of things that you don't need because there's not a previous agreement about what the needs are, and as a consequence, how to coordinate what people do. That's where I come from. So,
Yeah.
sorry.
I think on your first point, and I tried to allude to this in my presentation, but the investors aren't going to come in unless there's the good infrastructure that will permit their economic activity, whatever that infrastructure might be in the particular case. And on the end, that underlines the broader point you were making. I think it's very important to try to think through what the proper sequencing for all of these steps should be. And I think that'll be critical. So whether you're going to have a separate bureaucracy or a separate office within the prime minister or president's office or a special planning agency, whatever it is, someone's got to be thinking through all of those issues. And so you're right. I think the sequencing is critically important. On the humanitarian support, I'm not an expert in that, but what you say makes sense. And I read a lot about that in the books that the book that William Newman wrote about, and I wrote 2 book reviews of it about Venezuela. It just came out about a year ago, in which he says, Chavez would show up. There was some train in Caracas right before an election, and it was hardly built at all, but they got a photo opportunity out of it, just barely, and before an election. And so I understand what you're saying, and that's always a problem when you give. I've seen this in other countries, not just humanitarian support. When you give any economic assistance to one of these countries, it doesn't get to the intended recipients. Money gets hived off on the way down the food chain, and so, which underlines another point, perhaps, that you're going to need to have very strict corruption, integrity controls in place. I don't know whether you could ever aspire to be a Singapore, but thinking about how some governments are much more effective at policing corruption and inefficiency than others might be a way to go.
Okay. Well, Evanan is the last to talk, and with him we are closing this webinar. Come in, Evanan. You're mute.
Okay. Well, I don't want to bypass the suggestion by Hector Partidas. I don't know, in this phase, we need to discuss everybody's comment. So, with the permission of Dr. Steve, I will go to answer that. Many Venezuelans think the miracle solution is a Marshall Plan or a God given gift overnight. But I want to remind people that Hugo Chavez and Maduro have received 10 times the Marshall Plan over 25 years. Uh, Only 1.3 trillion in oil income plus the debt. So I don't think it will be a solution. The debt is almost equivalent to the accepted restructured debt in bonds and securities. Uh, but people try to, not to consider that if we relax just the royalty and fiscal terms in the business we've been doing for over 100 years now, we'll be able to increase the gross income of the country and the per capita basis from less than 2,000 sub-Saharan income to over 30,000 North European gross income because Venezuela has turned it the most expensive and uncompetitive player in its own trade business like oil. So, what is impeding or not permitting that? The government absolute socialist control of the main economic means. Okay. Um, Answering Dr. Krugman, Chinese debt, I assume, is about 12 billion, down from 65 billion initially. And Russian, I heard, is less than 10 billion, but mostly in military weapons that were incurred over this past year. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Doctor, okay, so we closed. We went over 1 hour from the time that Dr. Carmen allowed us, but I think it was a very interesting interaction between you and the audience. Thank you very much, Dr. Carmen, for this interesting uh, conversation today. And we really appreciate your thoughts and your answer to your questions. So we hope you will, like Eduardo said, will maintain contact and we'll have other opportunity to interact with you. So really, we appreciate your time and the effort that you made to make this presentation today. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.
Yes, muchos gracias.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Hasta luego.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hasta luego.